Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wisdom Seeker Live podcast. We are continuing our conversation on communication, and this is the second of three parts in our series. And welcome everyone from LinkedIn or Facebook or YouTube. Appreciate you being here with us today. I also ask you as you join to please include your information in the comments as to where you are joining from, and so that we know. We always like to hear from everyone in that regard. And a couple of housekeeping notes that I always like to mention is that I will be looking around at different screens as we are live, because that's part of what it takes. And since one of the things I do not have is a producer, if you will, I would have to do those things myself. So please don't think I'm being distracted. I am just managing what's going on. And welcome, Sharon. Sharon's one of our regular attendees, and appreciate you being here from New Jersey, Sharon. So also as part of our housekeeping and regular part of our show is just laying the groundwork for good communication. And that is talking about how we see wisdom. And wisdom is a journey that we're on. And wisdom begins with knowledge. And knowledge is great. It is valuable and helpful to us. And but it is not where we stop. Too many in our time and in our culture stop with knowledge, thinking that that's the power, and it really isn't. The power is in being able to apply knowledge and do so wisely. So the next part of that journey is gaining understanding in regards to the knowledge we've gained. And that means typically just life experiences and beginning to take our knowledge and doing something with it, use it in our day-to-day lives, and hopefully apply it and be effective with it. And then the next step and the least used aspect of the journey into wisdom is to gain perspective, and that's a big picture perspective. And that means looking at things from outside of ourselves, so that we not only understand or apply our knowledge and understanding to ourselves, but understanding how it affects others around us. Welcome, Tausif. So glad to have you with us, and appreciate you stopping in. Look forward to hearing your comments. And so seeing things from that big perspective, that's where we begin to gain wisdom. And we, for those of us that are of a spiritual bent, if you will, for us, it means trying to, as often as possible, to see and respond with our knowledge and understanding through God's eyes. And so it's that big picture and understanding how things are outside of ourselves. And welcome, Rosemary. Rosemary is one of our regulars from Sydney, Australia. Rosemary even stays up a little late into the evening to be able to join us. We appreciate that. And for those that maybe did not get to join us for the first episode, I just want to do a little catching up, and want to share a little bit about what we covered very briefly from the last episode. And as always, I like to share when we talk about any kind of concept, that we have a common a common basis for what we are dealing with. And so I look up the definition of communication, and communication is imparting or exchanging of information or news. And it means sending or receiving information. So pretty simple, yet it's kind of interesting that communication is one of the more difficult things that we find in relationships of all kinds, work and home and everywhere. And so becoming better at communicating and to include becoming wise in our communication can make a remarkable difference. And always like to share a bit about the visual aspects that as we see it culturally, and I like to Google what the concept is, in this case communication, and see the visual representations of what how we see it culturally, and we see a lot of different perspectives from a lot of the idea of exchanging information from our brains to each other, and the communication involves lots of pieces. You can see in here that it involves being effective, languages, barriers, just all kinds of different aspects. So we don't need to underestimate the importance and the value of communication. And then lastly, I do want to share with you the piece of information I shared last time, because I think it's helpful. And this is the graphic that we have related to it actually identifies the learning process, but communication is about learning. And so let me turn off this banner and welcome Scott. Scott's one of our regulars also. Glad to have you with us. But basically, you can see in this graphic that we all have some information that we want to give, and the process starts when somebody receives it. And once someone receives it, they have to process it. And ways that we process things: comparison, and we process things through breaking it down into parts we can understand. And then once we process it and it begins to help us with our understanding, then we start applying it, which as part of our journey, that is when we are getting into understanding and evidence of it. And then what we want to do, though, is to take it to the next level, and that is where we are wise. And so we last time we defined it, and we looked at the visual, and we started talking about the difference between communicating well and communicating wisely. We can communicate well. We can use the right words. We can enunciate everything. We can make it very clear and get a message across. The problem is if that message gets across at the wrong time in the wrong way, absent of context, then we are beginning to, or actually communicating unwisely. And knowing our audience is important because now with our world has shrunk, if you will, because for example, we have people on this podcast from all over the world, and so as we communicate, if we don't consider the audience, then we are going to be possibly both ineffective and unwise. Welcome, Apurva and Ahmad, to the podcast. Glad to have you with us today. By the way, I want to remind everyone, especially those that have not been here before, that I welcome questions and thoughts in the comments, and not only welcome them, but appreciate them. And then we also talked about the value of, excuse me, of listening as part of communication. And I know that most any of us can improve our communication skills solely by focusing in on more effective listening. And we want to, as we talk or communicate, realize that we need context, because the right word said in the right way in the wrong context can, again, cause us problems. I've even had moments where I was so anxious to answer someone's question before they finished that I did not pay attention to the whole question, and before they were done had my answer. And since I didn't pay attention, I realized that what I anticipated went a different direction. And so when they finished and I jumped in, my response was out of context, because I didn't wait and listen to the whole question. And then the whole concept of diversity is a part of our world now that we have to consider, and that we discussed last episode, that diversity is not just about culture, but age, a lot of different factors in diversity. So all of these things are a part of communicating well, but also communicating wisely, which they are not necessarily synonymous with each other. And so that's why we're having these conversations, so that we can ultimately strive to do both. And so as we gather on this topic again, one of the things that occurs to me is that we need to consider why we're wanting to communicate, not just and then what we want to communicate. And those are two things that we really need to take into account. Welcome, Duncan. Glad to have you. And so two things we should consider, and best to do so prior to communicating, is why we're communicating and what we want to communicate, not just what words we want to use. All the words are necessary to be considered, but they are not all that is to be considered. Let's see, Duncan has a comment. Let's see, Duncan. Listen, and listen some more. Oh, yeah. The only way to understand the person, their business, and what they need. Yes, as I shared with the group last Monday, I am still practicing, and probably will have to practice the rest of my life on being an active listener. And the importance of being an active listener can't be underestimated. In fact, for me, someone that is in current vernacular, I would have probably tested as either ADD or ADHD, or as we call it in my family, oh shiny thing disorder, because we can be in the middle of something and so, oh, squirrel. And so it challenge. And for me, active listening is a skill that I must develop, and to a point that I use some of my military background, that moments, if I'm speaking or training a group and I am trying to focus in on someone's question, I will assume a position that we use in the military called parade rest. And that helps me to be focused and to listen to what someone is saying. And hopefully the only people that realize that pose is those that are in the military and will appreciate it and not think it too odd. And so welcome, Elango, and appreciate you being here. And he makes a great comment, and that is communicate, don't talk. And so, yes, so we're getting into why we want to communicate and what we want to communicate. And, you know, folks, it's this thing called judgment is a hard thing. You know, we're not supposed to judge people's hearts because we're not qualified, frankly, you know, because we don't know what's going on in people's hearts. But one of the things that most of us are capable of is picking up on motivations. And so we need to consider our motivation as we communicate, because people do pick up on it. So we have to decide, are we trying to communicate to correct someone? Are we trying to communicate to educate or help someone learn? Or are we just trying to communicate to inform? So there's a lot of why we are going to communicate. And too often when we do this, go to communicate, we don't think about that. We don't consider it. And a good reason that we sometimes become offensive as we communicate is not that what we say is wrong. It's not that we've used bad communication skills in terms of our words and putting them together and how we speak them, but people pick up on our motivation. And the key thing that really creates a problem for us and determines reaction and will affect relationship is when we act, or we would say that we are motivated to help, when in reality our motivation is to correct, or, and unfortunately in some cases, to prove people wrong. And we see this on social media all the time. People responding to what's going on, and they think that they're trying to be helpful, when the reality is that it becomes obvious to the person they're addressing and to most people observing that the motivation is not one of genuine care and concern. It's more out of, well, I'll show you and prove you wrong in what you say. Welcome, Yaakov. Again, folks, if I mispronounce your name, please be patient with me. Welcome from Israel. And if I mispronounce your name, if you can type in and help me do a better job, I'm happy to do that. I'm always sensitive to people's names because I know that's important to all of us. And yes, Scott's from the U.S. here. He's from a neighboring state here. So thank you for letting us know. And so the why of our communication, something for us to give thought to. And one of the values of the considering why is, as we make that a part of our communication practice, it becomes more natural and it becomes built into what we do. Practice makes perfect, is the old saying. I've been practicing a long time, far from perfect, but I've gotten better, so that before we open our mouth, we will automatically go, why am I about to communicate this? And hopefully it will cause us to at least pause briefly long enough to consider what we're about to say and why we are about to say it. And glad to hear that Duncan's from both the U.S. and the U.K. Sounds like a long commute, Duncan, but I hope it's working well. And so the why of our communication, and to be honest with ourselves, why we are going to communicate. And this one really helps us, because not only does it help us to be wise, because we then consider the audience, it causes us to consider how we approach it, and we then also forces us to take a breath and take a moment. Welcome, Denise. Glad to have you here, and appreciate you joining today. I would ask that we keep advertisements at this point, unless they're germane to the topic. Please don't do that. So the why, and I hope that maybe you'll share in our comments as to how you see your whys, and what your technique for considering why. And then the other is, quite often we define our why, but we don't consider the what, and not to the extent that we need to do so wisely. And that is to go beyond the words, if you will. And I know one of the concepts that's very forefront in our world now, especially in our social media, is the idea of well, you ever have one of those moments where your mind just blanks out on you? Well, welcome to my world. The challenges of maturity, if you will. I had a great thought and it just jumped rail on me. So the why and what of what we are about in our communication. And one of the things, as we consider the why and what, will be the nonverbal parts of what we're doing and how we're approaching it. And so all of this leads to a bigger concept that I think it will make a massive difference for us as we go forward and communicate. And the concept is called measured response. And I think that quite often that we will not have measured response. And as we say in my area of the world, is that we put our mouth in motion before we put our brain in gear. And we say things that at best were not the best timing, but quite often we just put our proverbial foot in our mouth. And so really beginning to have measured responses as we approach. It rarely is it necessary that we have to respond instantly. If there's a life-threatening situation, maybe. But rarely do we encounter life-threatening situation. So stopping briefly, even a few seconds before we respond and consider our why and what, can make a really good difference in how we communicate. Let's see, Rosemary has a comment. She says, in my work, people rely on me to tell them the truth. What I have found is that even when the truth is heart-shattering, if the words come from my heart, then the words are less painful. It all comes down to where the words come from and why the conversation needed to be had. Great insight there, Rosemary. You know, there is one of the principles that I teach as part of being wise is balance. And balance is keeping our grip firm on two opposing good characteristics. And Rosemary's comment about having to tell people truth, but doing it from a heart, the way that I express it is that we express the truth, but we do it in love. And it's actually not original with me. That's actually a biblical principle. And for those of you that have not been with us before, one of the things that I do, and I hope not to offend, but if I'm going to be honest and share wisdom, I have to be willing to share sources of that wisdom that I find. And for me, a great source of wisdom, regardless of the religious tenets, is the Bible. So I will refer to that from time to time. Welcome, Bernhard from Madrid. Glad to have you again, and appreciate it. By the way, I do have to, since we are talking about communication, I do have to mention to a few of you, Bernhard was one that I got caught in a mistake of mine that involves some bad or poor communication. Is as I set this event up in LinkedIn, I was in a bit of a haste, and I set the event up, and I apparently, without realizing it, did not look at the time and date and get those updated. It had landed on a default time date. And so I did that and posted it, and then many hours later realized what had happened. And I had to communicate with some people that had signed up and were ready, and I suspect a bit disappointed or frustrated when they showed up at the time. And it was yesterday. I believe it was from 2 to 4 is what was on there. And they showed up and there was nothing going on. So I want to publicly apologize to you, and I appreciate your graciousness and understanding in responding. So Bernhard, I'm glad you're back in spite of my mistake from yesterday. And so communication, another example where it's important to consider what we do and say. And but hard communication, hard truth can and is in fact necessary, but quite often we avoid it because we don't want to cause anyone pain, and that's understandable. I don't. There are some people that are short-circuited and do that, but most of us would not want to cause people harm intentionally, and as a result, we shy away from being truthful, partly because we shy away from potential conflict, but also we have not learned how to effectively share that truth, and in a way that it is can be received in a better fashion, and that it is possible to do. And let me put Rosemary's comment back up, because again, it is a good indication, and that is to tell people the truth, but to do so from our heart, a place of understanding, and being able to help people realize that our goal is back to the why. Is in her case, Rosemary says she does that as part of her work, and explain to people that she's not just out there with the idea of, well, I'm going to tell you something that's painful just because I get some kind of strange enjoyment out of it, but it's rather something that I need to do. But part of it is in order to help you learn and grow. And in fact, that maybe you have been asked to communicate that as part of your task and assignment at your work. So all of this is part of our why and our what that we need to consider, and the environment that we are communicating in factor. How we would communicate in our work environment versus how we would communicate in a home environment makes a difference as well. And so as we consider our why and what, so that we're wise in that communication, those are all factors as well. One of the most difficult communications that we make is with our family, our loved ones, and especially our spouses. And the challenge there is that, what I find is that those relationships are especially important for us to practice active listening more than active speaking, because we need to, very rarely are we going to be the communicate well correction of those that we're closest to, and something to really consider in that process. In fact, I will share with you a little video clip that kind of goes to this whole area of communicating with our spouses. And if you want to get a chuckle, go to a little short video clip. It's called "It's Not About the Nail," and I think you can get a real chuckle out of it. And Duncan shares a comment, says, "Constructive truth, while not wanting to be heard, is beneficial and can be used to make something better in someone's life and business." Indeed, one of the, and in communication, one of the things that I have had to do, and this is a practice that I think it is worth considering, is that we say, speak the truth in love. And quite often we think of love as only compassion. Well, sometimes real love, if we care about someone, we have to be willing to take a chance on causing them at least short-term pain if we truly want to help them. And in some cases, to remain silent or to avoid the conversation is actually very uncompassionate and unloving. I give you what may sound like a little bit of a silly example, but it is a real life concept. We are with someone in a social setting that we value and think important, maybe even our spouse, and you have just been dining somewhere and you've gone to this social engagement where there are a lot of people around, and you look at your spouse and you realize that they have a piece of food stuck in their tooth that is evident, and you make a choice at that moment. Okay, do I say something and possibly embarrass them or hurt their feelings even, or do I not say something and let everybody else in the room see it, and them find out later that they embarrassed themselves in front of a whole large group of people? So in that case, which is more loving? Which is more compassionate? And those are the kinds of decisions we need to make as we consider our why and our what in communication. Yes, and Rosemary makes another comment. We need to practice active being present. And yes, and it's much more than just active listening. It is indeed being present in what's going on, involved and engaged, in what's going on, so that we communicate effectively. And I have to say, a reminder, being present quite often means getting outside of ourselves and getting considered that what we communicate is not just about us and how it affects us. And I think that what I observe, especially in social media environments, is that we get so caught up and feel protected that we will say and do things in that environment that are nothing more than pure selfish communication. And that's where we see people getting really hurt, and the comment trolling and haters and all of that is about how communication is handled, and not considering ourselves as being present when we're in social media environments, because quite often I see people react or respond or say things on social media that I am about 99% confident that if that person was face to face with the other person, they wouldn't dare say or do what they do. Okay, Yakov has a comment, says, in Jewish philosophy, communication is more than just a tool, it is who we are. Indeed, one of the things that we need to understand is that our communication ultimately flows out of who we are. And so, in fact, a biblical reference that I like to think about is that, it says, how can we spew both bitter and sweet out of our same mouth? And so what we need to really do is, if we want to be wise in communication, is to be wise in our total life, because our communication's an outflow of our life. No doubt about it. And great comment, Yakov. We appreciate that. It is definitely about life. And if you don't believe it, if you haven't already, and I suspect most of us have, had those moments where we have miscommunicated somehow, some way, and wow, to a point that it causes such pain in others' lives and our lives, we kind of go, to be figurative, hopefully, but we want to die at that point because we see what we've caused. And so the power of our communication is so key. And I think that, again, one of the challenges of social media that we see in our culture is that we don't appreciate or consider the power that we have in social media, because we feel like we are shielded from it. We are not face to face with people in that communication. But the one thing that we don't consider, and by the way, that we need to consider as we communicate, especially in social media, is that once it's out there, folks, and if you have communicated poorly and with bad words, bad whatever, at least when you are in person, the potential is that your words will at some point be forgiven, forgotten, and gone. But in social media, when you treat people poorly, it's out there forever. And so be really careful and understanding of that. To a point, by the way, that if any of you ever engage with me on social media, and I welcome people to disagree and have good discussion and dialogue, because it's a way to learn, and I'm always about learning. But there's a point on social media that I will just say, okay, well, we're going to have to just agree to disagree, and that, that's okay. We can do that in an agreeable fashion, but I won't take it any further in a social media setting, because when we get into that depth, it's just not the place or way, because it's ineffective, and it becomes hurtful, and just it's not worthwhile. And so just my personal rule is that there's a point I'll say, now we'll agree to disagree, and I'll offer quite often, if they want to sit down and have that conversation face to face, I'm open to that, because again, disagreement is a way of learning. By the way, Rosemary has located that video clip I talked about, and she's put it in comments in case you want to be able to get a chuckle out of that. And I think you will get a chuckle out of it. And it's especially fun to watch with your spouse. So, okay, and got another comment from Duncan. My partner, Kate, who I work with in her business, will tell who she is talking with that she is a straight talker and will say the truth, but then define it in order to help them. Very good. Quite often, when we explain our why in communicating, it changes how the communication is received, and it's very important. And I will share a personal story. As I began to, on my journey in leadership, I realized that in the role I was in as a school teacher, that not only was I a teacher, but in that environment, I was a leader. And so I started applying those principles in that setting, and these were high school students. And I had to learn that the way I was communicating something was being received wrong because my why was unclear. Okay. And in this case, I was and still am when I train, I care enough about people that I will not, especially if it's important, such as education, decisions, and looking in the future, that I will tell people the way it should be that's best for them. And even sometimes in, ways that people don't want to hear. And so as I went into teaching, my message or my desire was to help young people get ready for the world they were going into. And our education system doesn't do that effectively. And part of what I had to do was to raise standards, set expectations that these young people were not accustomed to. And what happened was, within my first 2 years of teaching, because I held them to higher expectation, I had my life threatened. And the word on the street from the students was, Mr. Ward, you better watch your back. And that was related to my not allowing young people to behave in a way that was not preparing them for what they were facing in the future. And in my mind, I was treating them with the greatest of love as if they were my own children. And that's what was in my heart. That was my desire. The problem is that I failed to help them understand the why, my heart in it. And so fast forward, applying the principles of leadership, I was able to clarify my vision as a teacher, and even go so far as to write it down. And then I shared this with my students, my why, and I even posted it up on the wall, printed it out on a big piece of paper, stuck it up on the wall. And once I shared that vision, a leadership principle, that helped my students begin to understand the why of what I was communicating with them. And once I did that, things shifted. Their demeanor changed, and it went from Mr. Ward, you better watch your back, to Mr. Ward, we've got your back. And so it matters when we communicate, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, as to the why. And if you don't do that well, people will react as people will, as any of us would. If we thought that, for example, someone was yelling at us something, and we thought that their intent was ill of us, we would react one way. But if we realized their intent was they were yelling at us to get out of the way of a falling object, our response is very different. And even having that situation where we're being yelled at from a friend versus someone we don't know. So all of this is about effective and wise communication. Welcome, Anwar from India. Glad to have you. And Apurva, I appreciate your support and your comments. Thank you. And difference in being wise and communicating well is important to note. And I believe that comes down to, in addition to practices, is really considering well the why we are communicating and what we really want to communicate. And one of the challenges, I know that most of us can appreciate the challenges of communication between men and women. It's been a struggle for many generations. And that's, by the way, a little bit about that little video clip is about is the how to communicate effectively with each other. And so the concept is that if we truly want to become an effective communicator, is beginning to understand not just what people say, but what people mean. And they may say one thing with their mouth, but if we're present and active listeners, we will also see that they are, what they say with their mouth alone would give us one message, but in the context of the other, we get a different message. So we are, as the saying goes, rather than listening to respond, we're listening to hear. And that makes a big difference. And so communicating well is great, and it's important. We have to learn to be effective in our communication, and that means gaining understanding of what words mean and using them in accordance. It also means putting them together well. And then there is another whole component to it as we do written communication, because as we do written communication, we have to consider a lot more, because when people read our written communication, they don't have the benefit of observing our behaviors, our nonverbal cues, and so on. So becoming effective is very important. One of the things that I enjoy doing is learning about the etymology of words, because it can be very insightful. And I shared with the group last week that there is a phrase that I used to use that meant the intent was to communicate doing something quickly and moving on with what we need to do. But when I understood the etymology of the phrase, I eliminated it from my active vocabulary, because once I understood the background and things, I realized it was crass and inappropriate, unprofessional, and just not a good way to communicate, even though it's a common slang phrase and most people probably don't take second thought of it. But it is a part of becoming an effective communicator. And I'll go ahead and tiptoe into a little bit of a dangerous zone, a little bit of a cultural minefield. And as we are talking about communication, and this comes up pretty regularly, so we'll see how y'all receive it. But the idea of the use of profanity, and it has become a recent topic of numbers of social media postings. Is it appropriate or is it professional to use profanity? And it's something that we need to consider in communication, because for some people, and especially in some environments, the use of profanity is no different than to use any other words. And yet, what is evident to me, in my opinion, is the use of profanity is never professional and rarely makes a point as effectively as good communication and use of words well, to a point. And again, I may step on some toes, and if I do, not my intent, but just to get us to consider our communication. As the saying says, that profanity is the vehicle for by which we demonstrate our ignorance. And don't confuse ignorance with stupidity. There are very intelligent, smart people that demonstrate their ignorance by using words, especially profanity, and rather than other words and other ways that could be more effective in making a point. And having worked in the business world and helped business leaders, I will tell you still to this day that most environments, that use of profanity in a business environment especially, is considered unprofessional and inappropriate. And the argument is sometimes that people will say it helps to make a point. Well, yes, but is it the best way and only way to make that point? And I would contend that if we become effective communicators, there are alternatives that also don't take the chance of being offensive or alienating unnecessarily. So more about communications. It's a tough topic. One of the things that I shared in looking at, I developed a graphic related to strategy and vision. In fact, I don't know if I can readily find it. If I can, I will share it. Duncan, no apology needed. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule and joining us. And I hope you will indeed join us next week. We're going to have a special guest, and I'll share a little bit more about that special guest before we wrap up. But thank you again for being here, and I appreciate your insights and thoughts. So have a great day and look forward to seeing you next week. So continuing on, let me see if I can pull up this graphic. And when I pull it up, I think you'll hopefully appreciate where I'm going with it. Sometimes I have to remember in my communication that my brain works one way in how I process, and what I have to realize is that people don't always see the context of what's going on in my head, so I have to make it a point to give that context. And it's a good practice for any of us, because we don't always communicate the same way, and giving the context can make a difference. So I'm going to take just a second and look for this graphic to see if I can find it. If not, you can also see this on my LinkedIn profile, and if you want it, find it helpful to use it. And I bet it's just not going to come up quickly. So anyway, I won't waste your time by searching for that right now. Oh, wait a minute. Is this it? Rosemary has a comment. So while I'm looking for that, let's look at Rosemary's comment. It says, I grew up in remote areas and in the transport industry. My dad taught me the difference between profanity as an insult and profanity as a general speak. There was one golden rule in my family in regards to profanity, and that was that on the outside of the garden gate, limited profanity was not noticed. However, inside the garden gate, we were on mom's domain. You had to consider that appropriateness of where we're at in the use of it. And certainly if anyone is determined that they need to use profanity, be very careful, please. I tell you that it will, at a minimum, cause potential misunderstanding and hurt. And at a worst case, it can be damaging and make the person using it look very foolish and unprofessional. So choice or consideration in terms of being wise in our communication is to consider our why. Why are we communicating in the first place? And secondarily, what is it we really, really want to communicate to others? Be thoughtful of that. And as we consider the what, we need to realize that we need to give context of it and make sure that the words we choose is effectively communicating what we want to communicate. And so be wise in your communication, do well in your communication. And if, as we do that, we will begin to find that our relationships work better. We save ourselves embarrassment and grief, and we probably will prolong and improve the relationships we have, whether at work or at home. So really consider being wise in your communication, not just communicating well. Welcome, Daniel. Glad to have you. Good to hear from you. And so next week, we will have part 3 of this 3-part series. And for the third episode, I have invited a colleague and a friend to be our guest. And this is, some of you may know her, is Virginie LeMay on LinkedIn. And Virginie and I have worked together as colleagues, and her role in our relationship there was or is, and that of communication, especially in a diverse environment. And Virginie is really good at it. And I think that she will be able to share with us a lot of insight and wisdom. I know that she has helped me a lot with my perspectives on communication. So next week, same time, Monday, 8 a.m., we'll be on LinkedIn, we'll be on Facebook and YouTube, so you can invite others to join. And you don't have to register officially. The registration is to help with notifications and helps me communicate with people that have registered as we get closer to live. And so I encourage you to join us for the third part and invite friends to come along. The more the merrier, because one of the values of being a part of a group and a network is to benefit from one another's experiences and benefit from others' wisdom, so that maybe we don't have to gain some wisdom the hard way, and we can learn it from others' experience. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate you giving roughly an hour of your time being here with us. And I hope that you take away value, and most of all, that you are gaining wisdom as part of this, because that is what we're all about, is to help each other gain wisdom in life and be more effective. So God bless you all. Rosemary, thanks for staying up with us. And I appreciate everyone being here, and look forward to seeing you next week. Monday, 8 o'clock a.m. Eastern, right here on any of the channels you like. So thank you again. I appreciate it. Have an amazing week, and go wisely into that week. Take care. Bye, everyone.